Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on the power of strategic planning. Now, before we begin, we just have a few housekeeping items to take care of. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the slides and the video recording will be sent to you shortly. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but questions can be asked at any time using the GoToWebinar dialog box. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but if we're unable to get to your question at that time, don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@virtualinc.com. At the conclusion of the webinar, we ask that you please stay on for just a few moments to complete a brief survey that will show up in the pop-up window. And if you are a CAE, this webinar is worth 1 credit. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Andy Freed, the CEO of Virtual, and Greg Kahn, our Chief Growth Officer.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brian. Hey, look, there's pictures of us and everywhere and everything. So now you can tell that either that's who we are, or that's the best stock art photos we can find. And if it's the latter, that's really a sad case for the two of us. But we're delighted to be here today. Both Greg and I spend a lot of time with organizations all over the world that are doing strategic planning processes. And what we wanted to share with you today was some of the things that we've picked up and some of the lessons that we've learned. And the phrase and the title of this is so important, this idea of 10 ways to demystify your strategic planning. And if we look at the next slide, it's the idea of, there's 10 things you can do. And we're going to spend some time over the next few minutes. It's the law that there's more than 3 people on this webinar, so we have to have a whole set of PowerPoint slides. So we'll spend some time over the next few minutes walking through all 10 of these. And I'm not going to do the business karaoke and read these off to you. But what I can tell you is that these range from things that are big picture items to little practical tips that we think will help your strategic plans go better. And one of the things that always makes a planning session go better is to bring the right people to the session and stay a bit out of their way. So in that spirit, for the first one, let me turn it over to Greg. Greg, take it away.
Thanks, Andy. Starting with why. In my experience, so many groups just want to dive in and start fixing things and doing stuff. And that's natural because a lot of strategic planning for associations is driven by what's not going well or what needs to get fixed. But in the course of working with lots of organizations at the planning level, what I'm amazed at is how many times I challenge a board or a planning group to talk about their core mission and purpose. And when that happens, how many times they actually realize they do not have alignment at that most basic core level of what are we here to do and why. Ultimately, in my view, why is the very foundation of both your organization and your strategic plan. So you really need to make sure that it's rock solid. I think it's also important to continuously re-examine the why for your organization in light of what's happening around your organization and in the broader world and the context of your group. For instance, maybe your why or your mission statement is still spot on, but perhaps it's time to expand internationally or move into different market spaces and things like that. In my experience, testing alignment on mission is also valuable to ensure that new leaders in your organization, maybe who were not part of the last planning session that you undertook, have the same fundamental understandings around the mission and around the purpose of the organization. Bringing them into the fold also, potentially helps bring fresh ideas to the table as you start into this process. And then finally, a word of caution. So many times when we propose the question of, well, let's pause and get to the why. Why are we here? Why does this organization exist? That naturally leads into a painful process of wordsmithing a mission statement and making sure that the commas are in the right place and that the right verbs are being used. And that's not really the intent at all. We like to sideline mission statement work to a task force that can spend all the time they want on that. Use the time with your group wisely, get to the basics of why, and then move forward. But it's really important. It's the foundation for all of the planning that happens after that. So Andy, I'll turn it back to you to talk about what happens after we talk about why.
Yeah, and Greg, I totally agree with what you're saying. I've wanted to throw myself out of many of a first floor conference room window when the process starts of, hey, let's recraft the mission statement together. There's 20 of us. I know most great works of literature were actually written in conference rooms by 20 people, looking at a PowerPoint slide. It's very, it's a little known stat, but that just never works. And one thing which I think is a practical strategy which does work, what you're talking about, is things like just putting your mission statement on the agenda, just making sure that it's printed in front of people so they remember it. And as you're doing that and thinking about those questions, I love this phrase, don't rebuild. And you talked about, why does the organization exist? You also need to think about, why are we having this retreat? And when I ask people, why are we going through a strategic planning process? I hear things like, well, we're going through strategic planning because we want to have a retreat, and our retreat's always someplace cool, so we have to justify it. Or we're doing this because it's what we've always done, and that's really important to us. We do this, and all we do is we look at our strategic planning process, and our plan for 2020 is the same thing as our plan for 2015, but we change the headers. And sometimes it's well, we have a facilitator, and this guy shows up and makes us do it. Sometimes it's well, we just like to come up with these ideas and they don't go anywhere. These are all things I either hear or observe from plans all the time. When I think about what should be the goal of a planning process, one of my favorite headlines of all time was on September 8th of 2002, and it's this headline right here. This was the headline of a special section of the New York Times Magazine on the 1-year anniversary of 9/11, and the idea was don't rebuild, reimagine. And so many organizations, when they're getting together for strategic planning, they're talking about rebuilding. They're talking about at best, well, we had our conference last year in Vegas, and now what we're going to do is we're going to really do something crazy this year. We're going to have it in Orlando instead, and we're going to have, last year we had 3 breakout sessions. So this year, instead of them being in the Mirage ballrooms, this year they'll be in the Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck ballrooms. That's not reimagining something. Reimagining it is, boy, why are we bringing to Greg's point, the question of why? Why are we bringing our members together? What are we trying to get out of it? And where are we trying to go? That's reimagining it. Now, as you do it, there is another word that's important to remember as you start getting folks together. And that's this next word on item 3. And that's this important word, meatloaf. Now, you might wonder, and some of you I know on the East Coast are forced to take this webinar during your lunch hour, so you might think that I'm digressing on, starting to talk about food. But there's a lot of different thinkers that I like when it comes to boards, when it comes to strategic planning. I love Tom Peters. I think that his work is incredible. Peters is not a big fan himself of James Collins, who wrote Built to Last, but I actually like James Collins quite a bit as well. Jack Welch is really influential. He's kind of the CEO of CEOs, but the person who I like best and who I rely upon most, if I just need somebody whose words of wisdom carry me through strategic planning processes, is this guy, Meatloaf. Now, Meatloaf only had one good album. We all know it. And that, of course, is the Bat Out of Hell album from, I believe, it was 1977 or 78. And to quote Mr. Loaf in the classic 2 out of 3 ain't bad, baby, we can talk all night, but that ain't getting us nowhere. And it's so important in a strategic planning process to heed the words of Mr. Loaf. So many times when we're doing a strategic planning process, it's just talking all night and getting us nowhere. So think about, what are you trying to get out of this? What are the outcomes you want? Understand that, be willing to shut down conversation and move on from conversation that is just talking all night but getting you nowhere. Mr. Loaf has it right. Greg, how do you make that work in terms of a process?
Well, Andy, it's funny, but before I get into that, I once learned in a leadership seminar that you really don't want to be the guy that follows Meatloaf, but I'll give it a shot anyway. Regarding process, what I've learned in the course of facilitating many strategic planning efforts is that almost every single person in the room has a very different understanding of what strategic planning means and how it's done. In my view, and I think I speak for Virtual, we understand that there's no single right way to do strategic planning. What we do agree is that it's really critical for organizations that are starting into a planning process to define the structure that they will use. Within Virtual and on behalf of our clients that we work with, we try to take a very, very simple view of strategic planning. And it basically entails 4 questions that are deeply interconnected. Where are we today? Where are we going as an organization? How are we going to measure our success as we move down that path? And then most importantly, how will we get there? It's also really important to define what you are going to create through the process. Many people who are participant in planning processes generally assume that what's going to come out is a giant, really thick, detailed strategic planning document that maps out every single step the organization will take over a period of time. The reality with those documents is they take an awful lot of effort to create, and then at the end of the day, they often get put into a drawer or on a bookshelf and never looked at again. So we try to take an approach where strategic plans are really valuable documents that are basically the reference point for the organization for the life of their plan and in a practical way. Therefore, we prescribe a really simple approach. Rather than think about a plan as a detailed list of things to do, we think about a plan in terms of guardrails. These are the general directions that the organization is going to proceed upon in a period of time. And then it serves as a set of guardrails for the rest of the organization to make those more detailed plans and figure out how to advance the strategy through those plans. We'll talk a little bit more in this webinar about that execution piece. But in short, some of the best strategic plan documents that we've created out of a planning process for a client organization or even for our own company is just 1 page. And again, it sets those guardrails and it really enables the rest of the organization to come into the planning process and build the execution model.
Yeah, Greg, if I could put out an ad, a book ad for something that was written by somebody other than Meatloaf, there's a great book out there called Mastering the Rockefeller Habits. That talks about 1-page strategic plans for organizations, and really talks about the things you need to do and has templates and things that will really walk you through the simplicity of it. And so many organizations get caught up in, well, it's a strategic planning process. We need to create this 200-page tome that nobody's going to look at. Something that's practical and something that's useful is really what you want more than anything. I couldn't agree with you more. Back to you, Greg, on the right players.
All right. This is another critical juncture in the strategic planning process. The decision that you want to make at the start of the planning process around who should be part of the process. Many times within associations, the natural instinct is that the board of directors should run and drive the strategic planning process. While that may be the case in some organizations and for good reasons, we sometimes caution against that because in our experience, top-down plans developed in a vacuum by a board of directors generally fail to get the traction they need because they don't have the buy-in and the input from the broader organization. There's a few ways to get around that trap. One is to consider a cross-functional, diverse planning committee that certainly needs to have representatives from your board of directors, but also from different parts of your organization, volunteers, committee leaders, even people from outside your organization, staff, and whatnot. I think in my experience, the more diverse you can make your planning group, the more perspectives and voice you can bring into the planning process. And I find that it enriches the whole process. In cases where your board prefers or feels it's the right arm to drive strategy, that's okay. but try to think about how you can bring those external voices, either from outside your organization or from across within the boundaries of your group, into the process. Get regular feedback, ask questions out to the community, and so forth. Really, the diversity of perspectives is what really makes a great plan. And as I mentioned earlier, really gets that buy-in from the rest of the organization. And the one really critical ingredient that we tend to find in planning is facilitation. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I think facilitators are so critical. It's hard for somebody who is at the table as a board member or has an interest in things to really drive the discussion as well. It's a really hard dual role, and really driving the meeting to some extent takes you out of the flow of participating in the meeting. So when we're running, when we see organizations that are going through strategic planning processes, having an independent facilitator is really important. And it's somebody who can, make sure that the wisdom of Mr. Loaf is heeded. And I always look at that as, my primary role as facilitator is to drive things to outcomes. As you're doing that, good facilitators do a few things. They tend to challenge folks and refine things. Sometimes that means positing false choices or doing things that feed things back to get you down to something. But it's really important that a facilitator plays that role. Sometimes it's also calling on those quiet voices at the table, making sure that somebody who seems disengaged, if they're not disengaged, they disagree. And then lastly, it's all about the facilitator's job in the end is to make sure that something written and something memorialized comes out of this. And absent that, you could be just talking all night and getting us nowhere. And the facilitator is the person that keeps that from happening, and the facilitator is the one that asks the right questions to keep things working. If only I had some idea, though, Greg, what are the right questions to keep things working? Do we have any idea? Oh my gosh, there's a slide on that. Who knew?
There is. If you reference back to our very simple planning structure, particularly the first two core questions, where are we today and where are we going? Our perspective is that you really can't make any leap forward, particularly meaningful ones, unless you really understand where you are at as an organization at the current point. When I work with organizations, I call that the current state analysis. What you want to caution against is sort of general sweeping perspectives from folks within the walls of a conference room saying, okay, I know where we're at, and this is where we're at, this is where we're going. So we use a series of techniques. These are not the only ones to use, but to really go into a planning process by establishing a really rich baseline of perspectives, not just those among or within the planning process, but as far and wide across the organization as practical. So on the next slide, one of those techniques that we tend to use is a series of one-to-one interviews. Spending 30 minutes asking a few pointed questions of key stakeholders within your organization, board members, committee members, volunteers, staff members, etc., is just a wonderful way to get those perspectives to help start to build that baseline of understanding of where the organization is at, what's working well, what's not working so well, what are the low-hanging opportunities to advance the organization and its mission, and things like that. These are just enormously helpful, and they don't have to take very long, and they don't have to be very taxing, but we find them to be invaluable. Another way to get data is to survey different populations of members or volunteers or just folks within your community. Our prescription here is to try to keep the surveys as simple as possible, but ask obviously the information that you want to collect that you feel is important. But in our experience, aiming for a high response rate is better than, in some cases, depth of input. And then finally, in sort of a new terrain in the strategic planning realm, we've begun to use what we call decision tools. These are web-based applications that really allow planning groups to do some of their work in an asynchronous manner. And, you know, as folks on the call certainly understand, getting people together in the same place, you know, for a day or two is a big commitment. People have day jobs, people, you know, have travel restrictions and whatnot. So we've been finding an increasing suite of tools that enable us and enable the groups we work with to do more of their work asynchronously in a very collaborative manner and in a way that really tees up a lot of value when the groups come together face to face. Andy, I think this is a great segue into what you call the 3 Ls. So I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I think that it's really important to keep these in mind. And I like that they're all alliterative, which makes it a little bit easier. And it's 3 words that are very simple and very simple to remember, but sometimes hard to do. And the first one is look. And that's looking outside of your organization. And so many organizations, when they're starting a board meeting, and I'll look at board meetings that are entirely about, well, we get together as a board and we do committee reports, and first the membership committee and then the finance committee, and that's what we do. Then they'll get together for strategic planning, and they'll immediately just start talking about, well, this is what we've always done, so let's take a look at these things and just see if we want to do them maybe slightly differently. Well, the first thing you want to do as in a planning process is look outside, and look and see what are the things that are happening out there in the environment outside of your 4 walls that might be changing your assumptions. Back in the 80s, for years, Sports Illustrated functioned as, well, we published a magazine. This is what we do. And they would get together and presumably talk about it, and they'd say, well, maybe we want to change our magazine, and maybe we want to, add special issues or something along those lines. Well, they missed so many trends that were happening out there. The biggest one being ESPN had come along and said, we're in the sports information business. And we're going to provide sports information through a website. We're going to provide it through, at this point, 8 or 9 channels of television. We're going to provide it eventually also through a magazine. And they, essentially ate Sports Illustrated's lunch. Sports Illustrated is no longer a weekly. That's a pretty big change from where they once were. And there's so many cases where things can happen positively and negatively on the outside that change your organization and change your mission. The March of Dimes was formed to stamp out polio. The Salk vaccine came along. That changed things for them. They need to look outside and understand that things are changing. We've got to change along with it. Now, as you're doing it, the next thing you want to do is listen. Talk to your members and listen to them. As Greg said, it's important to ask questions, but as you're doing that, listen to folks. Surveys are important. Asking folks to get a sense of what are some of the things that are working and some of the things that aren't working for them. Making sure that you're mystery shopping, seeing what's happening with your membership, looking at things from their perspective, and hearing the things that are going on. And listening also means listening to things sometimes that you don't like to hear, and listening to the feedback that might be a little painful but might be true. That's so important. But listening is only a piece of it. The last piece is leading. And Andy Grove, who was the one-time chair of Intel, once said that innovation comes from doing what your customers would want if they only knew enough to ask about it. I love that. The idea that you're doing what your customers want if they only knew to ask. And when I think about it, there are so many innovations that are out there. I didn't know I wanted them. I'm sitting here right now in my office with my iPad and my Apple Watch. I didn't know I needed a smartwatch. I thought I was really happy. Turns out I needed one. Same thing with the iPad. Didn't know I needed it. Turns out I did. That's innovation. It's leading folks someplace where they didn't know they wanted to go. And that comes from rebuilding and asking the right questions. That's really your role as a board. Another key thing, and another word that doesn't fit into the L's, is the magic word. You're going to move up the alphabet 2 notches now to the from the L's to the N's, and that's the word no. As a strategic planning process, what's so important is that you're willing to say no. Now, in Built to Last, James Collins said that you're not going to have a to-do list if you don't have an equally long stop doing list. And that's why so many leaders have said that the hardest thing about leadership, it's not saying, it's not saying yes, it's saying no. And how do you get an organization, from no to another key word, which is focus? How do you get an organization focused on the right things? Now, two folks that didn't agree on much were Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. But if you look at the two of them, what did Gates say? My success was all about that I focused on a few things. Steve Jobs, when he returned to Apple, the first thing he did when he returned to Apple in 1997, slashed 90% of the product line. Think about that. Jobs came back to the company and dropped 90% of the product line. How many times have I been through a strategic planning process where one of the assumptions is, well, we've got to keep doing that product because so and so on the board, that's his pet project. We got to keep doing that one. We've always been doing that, and we've got to keep doing that one too. We're not willing to say no. As a result, focus deteriorates, and you wind up not achieving your goals. So how do you know whether or not you've achieved your goals? I guess, the way for that is one more word, and that's measure. And understanding, what are the things and the measures to success? What are the things that are going to be, things that will let you know, whether or not the organization is getting to where you want it to go. If you're a for-profit company, it's pretty easy. You're looking at your earnings, you're looking at your stock price, you're looking at things like that. Nonprofits, it's a little bit more complicated. Nonprofits wind up having to look at what are the things that really matter. Is it membership growth? Is it outcomes of what you're influencing? But unless you have figured out what you're going to measure as part of your plan, unless you understand what it is you're measuring and how you're going to measure success, you're going to be talking all night and it's getting you nowhere. And again, that's a great song lyric, but it's a really hard way to run an organization. So coming up with measurements, making sure you agree upon them, and making sure that they're realistic. It shouldn't be, hey, we've had folks who have come into strategic planning process and said, they'll make a big deal of this organization's 1,000 members, and I think that we need to, as a board, say that we're going to get this to 25,000 members in the next hour. Well, there's not 25,000 possible members out there. Come on, that's not realistic. Thinking about things that are realistic and measurable is so important for you want to go, because then you can take the strategic plan to really where you want it to be, which is how do you execute and how do you drive an execution plan off of that? Greg, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, first just getting back to the measurements part. I mean, practical increment-based measurements are so critical, and I've sat through plenty of meetings where that what I call the weather forecast measurement is put out there, and it just has to be real, or the plan is doomed to fail and pretty quickly. But ultimately, it does get down to the brass tacks of you can have the best strategy outlined, but how do you actually move the organization into execution against that plan? The first thing we want to do, I think, is talk about roles and responsibilities. As we mentioned earlier, sometimes the board of directors takes the onus of developing the strategic plan for the organization, hopefully not in a vacuum. But ultimately, that group tends to have the responsibility for approving the strategy of the organization. And then from there, as the slide says, it really has mission control. It makes sure that the plan is being advanced, and that all of the resources of the organization, volunteer, staff, etc., are mobilized in concert to advance that plan. And of course, that it's all under the proper budget guidelines and whatnot. But in terms of actually developing the execution side of an organization's plan, our prescription is that this is where the broader organization comes in. Again, as we talked about earlier, we view a strategic plan as a set of guardrails that really outline the overall strategic direction of the group. And then from there, what we like to encourage is a group to challenge the rest of the organization, its committees, its working groups, its task forces, staff, etc., to actually think about how they can enable and drive success toward the strategic plan of the organization. And this is where the detail happens. So each group says, okay, this is what we can do to move the plan forward. Here's exactly what we're going to do and what not. We also think it's really important to have transparency at this point so that the board of directors understands all of the different execution plans that have been developed across the organization to make sure that there's no redundancy, there's no gaps, and also to understand budget impact. And to Andy's point earlier, to make sure that if the organization is moving in a whole bunch of new directions at once, what do they potentially have to stop doing to enable all of that? The other thing is at the execution level, staff should be part of that effort. Staff, in our view, the staff, whether it's direct staff, management, company resources, etc., they should be part of the equation of driving an organization's strategy forward. They almost always have a role and should be brought meaningfully into that process, but working hand in hand with the volunteers at different levels. The other part of execution is just being crisp and clear, that when you're talking about advancing a strategy and implementing it, you want to make sure that you're always defining who owns different pieces of a plan, when different pieces will be delivered, and most importantly, what's going to be produced as a result. So again, clear owner, clear deadline, and then clarity about what's being delivered. And again, I'm a firm believer in transparency across the organization so that anyone in the organization knows what each committee or each working group is planning to produce. And so transparency is really critical on the execution side. Andy, once an organization has gone through the process of building its plan and then laying out an execution framework to advance that plan over time, what's a best practice to make sure that the plan doesn't go stale or loses momentum?
What do you mean, Greg? I thought once you did a strategic plan once, it was done forever and that you never had to revisit these things. Are you saying that outside assumptions could actually change?
I am saying that, Andy, yes.
My gosh, that's stunning. And in fact, you'd think that that was a revelation for so many groups, because so many groups will talk to it and they'll say, well, we did a plan. Well, we did it, 3 years ago. We did it 5 years ago. We're good. At least once a year, if not more, somebody should at least check in on the plan. Take a look at it. Make sure that what we have makes sense. It's worth revisiting. And are adjustments needed? So really as a board, actively looking at the plan, to see whether or not things make sense and test it against some of those outside assumptions is so important. So, it's not something which is just done and can be put on a shelf forever. It's something which really needs to be revisited constantly. So, things change, outside assumptions change, the world changes, and that's the message. The organizations that we were talking about earlier, the March of Dimes, ESPN, these are all groups that things on the outside that were outside of their control changed. And unless you're taking the time to look at it and look at innovation, you can miss things and the world can pass you by. So these things are so important, and they're just the starting point of getting things heading in the right direction and making sure that your organizations are effective. So with that, I think we have mercifully for folks on the line come to the end of our PowerPoint presentation, but we're happy to spend some time and take some questions and turn it out to folks. The questions portal is on your screen. You can type them in. I believe we have a couple that have come in already that Bree, you can you might have available. But what do we have for questions? So, Greg, one that I saw already pop up was the question of, should an executive director participate in the process, and can the executive director be the facilitator? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a pretty strong opinion on that. I think an organization that has an executive director should include that person in the planning process. I think they play a critical role of bridging the staff function in the execution of a plan, and I think they're an important voice in the process. To what we talked about earlier in the presentation, I think because of that, it's often a very real struggle to expect the executive director to both be a meaningful part of the planning and also facilitate the planning. And so my advice is, if you have an executive director, by all means include them, but at that point, maybe look to the outside or even to someone else in the organization who can serve as the facilitator of the planning, so that it doesn't put sort of a dual burden onto the executive director.
So thanks, Greg. Greg, we also had a question that came in about some of the decision tools that we were talking about. I know there have been some, little trends and trendies on decision tools that are out there. Can you speak to some of the tools that we've been using?
Sure. I'll make a pointed plug to one such tool that we've been using increasingly across our work in driving planning for organizations. It's a tool called Power Doodle, and it really just encapsulates into one application just a lot of pathways for collaboration within a planning group. It also easily allows facilitators to extend the reach of planning almost on a limitless basis. And then the real nice part about it is just the richness of the analytics behind all of the collaboration. You can do voting, you can do rating, you can do tagging, and all of that just creates a really rich data set that can be, sliced and diced, and creates a great foundation for, other work of a planning committee or a board. So again, that's called powernoodle.com, and it's one that we've selected because it fits our needs and just kind of our planning approach well. There's likely others out there, but what we found is, beyond the tool itself, just the asynchronous nature of being able to drive parts of the planning process without having to get people onto a conference call and without having to get them into a face-to-face room as often as we used to has been a real help.
Yeah, I think that also just speaks to wanting to look out there, and the whole notion of looking also includes to how you do your strategic planning process. Things that used to always require everyone schlepping across the country or around the world to be in a conference room, it can now be done, as you said, can be done asynchronously and be done different ways. And I think that's a really important thing for folks to recognize, is that the process itself needs to adapt, and things can change with time, for sure. Greg, how about on pet projects and the things that are out there? We talked about how important it is to have a stop doing list. Every now and then there are those things out there that it's somebody's project, and it's it's hard to stop. Any advice for organizations that are having a tough time saying no?
Yeah, I think it actually gets to something that we didn't cover in the presentation, but I think is a really important element. We talk about the strategic plan as a set of guardrails for the organization, and we talked about how, for instance, committees and working groups use those guardrails as they create their execution plans against the strategy. I think it's also important that, for instance, a board of directors, in the course of its everyday work, when it meets and comes together, that it also uses those guardrails to manage the organization and to perform its functions. And so, for instance, the framework or the guardrails of the strategy should almost dictate or formulate the agenda for board meetings. How are we doing on this piece of strategy? How are we doing on that piece of strategy? And that can really help a board maintain that strategic focus, which we know, can be a challenge for some groups, and help them not get into the operational weeds. But that framework or those guardrails can also, in my opinion, protect against those pet projects where, let's say a long-term board member comes up with an idea. Hey, I've always wanted to do this, and why don't we get that moving? Well, if it doesn't really fit in those guardrails and it doesn't meaningfully connect to the strategy, I think it gives the broader board of directors or whatever governing group it is within an organization sort of permission and something to reference to say, yeah, no, that just doesn't fit where we're going, and maybe bring that up another time, or if our strategy pivots. And I think having that reference point by which to say no is really important.
No, Greg, I couldn't agree more. And I think that it's so important that people use that and use their mission statement as the way to really understand what they should and shouldn't be doing. And I'll tell you though, as you mentioned pet projects, it reminds me that as we are now approaching the end of our time, we have now spent more time on a webinar than has ever been done in U.S. history without somebody's dog barking on the phone. So before we before we try our luck and get to the end of that streak, we should probably keep within our allotted time. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. We'll be sure that we'll to get the recording and the slides out to folks as we move forward and make things available. I'll also say that Greg and I are always happy to commit with organizations on what's happening with your strategic plan and how we can help. This is something that Greg and I both do for a living, sure, but we also do it because we enjoy it. We love to help organizations get to the next level and help organizations succeed. Our mission at Virtual is driving the success of our clients, and if we have an opportunity to do that, an opportunity to help organizations succeed, that's really what we enjoy every day. So feel free to reach out if we can be of help. And with that, please make sure you also stay on the line to take a short survey at the end. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll look forward to talking to many of you in the future.